Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the U.S. Constitution and Homeland Protection. This video, we're going to talk about the constitutional law and its history, but focus on the federal versus the state powers. All right, what powers the federal government has and what powers the state government has. All right, so first, the Constitution itself divides the powers between the federal government and the states. And it does this by enumerating which powers the federal government can exercise, while also enumerating which powers the state is prohibited from exercising. All right. And also states within the Constitution that powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are hereby reserved to the states or to the people. Okay. So it's going to look a little confusing, right? The U.S. Constitution enumerates which powers the federal government has. It prohibits what powers the states can exercise, and also provides that any power not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states and to the people. Fair enough? All right, it's a little tricky, but it spells out, the Constitution spells out the federal government powers, what's prohibited by the states, and also state is the federal government doesn't have those powers and it's not prohibited by the states, then it resorts to the states themselves. Okay? But within that, the federal government is supreme within its sphere of operation. When Congress enacts laws within the scope of its enumerated powers, its law prevails over anything within the states, if it's contrary or whatever. All right. So when Congress enacts legislation that is within its scope of enumerated powers within the Constitution, that law prevails over any contrary state laws. Okay. Certain powers that are granted to federal government. First off, the power the federal government has, we all know, is to levy taxes. Levy taxes on the people, right? And make expenditures for the national defense and welfare, right? It's the power to tax. No government can survive without a source of revenue. And that was a problem with the Articles of Confederation, if you remember. All right, so one of the first enumerated powers that the federal government has is the power to tax. Second is the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. The United States can borrow on its behalf, and there's nothing you can do, right? It borrows on its credit. We always hear about the debt ceiling. All right. So this borrowing allows for an auxiliary source of revenue on top of taxes. All right. So you got tax revenue, and then the government can borrow money. The third power granted to the federal government is the power to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Now, this is interesting for us from a law enforcement perspective, because the Commerce Clause is one of the most important powers granted to the federal government, and it gives a lot of power, right? This is the Commerce Clause within the Constitution. It gives a lot of power to the federal government, and therefore a lot of power to the federal officers who protect the federal government or work on behalf of the federal government. So the Commerce Clause is an important power that the federal government has, and it uses it on a variety of things. All right. It allows it to regulate channels and instrumentalities used for interstate commerce, such as roads, bridges, waters, tunnels, etc. Right. So those are under the powers of the federal government through the Commerce Clause: roads, bridges, waters, tunnels, and etc. And it also allows it to regulate persons or articles that move through interstate commerce. Okay, so once a person or that good or whatever it is moves into interstate commerce, that comes under the federal purview, right? Any commercial activity that has a substantial relationship to interstate commerce becomes federal, right? So that means the FBI may be involved as opposed to local law enforcement. All right, so this Commerce Clause gives a lot of power to the federal government, and therefore the federal agencies that work for the government, federal government. All right. Other powers that established that the federal government has: immigration, naturalization, and bankruptcy. Three big ones, especially now. Laws regarding immigration are huge right now, right? That's all they're talking about in the federal government, right? The border, especially at the southern border, how somebody becomes a citizen, how they become naturalized as a citizen. All right, those are all powers within the federal government's purview. So there's, law enforcement jobs with regards to this. Border agents are a big one. You want to work in law enforcement, you can work at the border, become a border agent. All right, and this falls under the federal government purview. All right. Power to regulate currency is another power that the federal government has, right? Coin money, designate mediums of exchange, dollars, $5, $10. The right to punish counterfeiters, all right, and establish agencies to enforce currency, right? Here we go again. Establish law enforcement agencies to enforce currency laws. Department of Treasury, right? Many opportunities for people who are interested in law enforcement. All right, power to regulate currency is it's a federal power. Another federal power that the federal government has is the power to secure for authors and inventors the exclusive rights to their writings and discoveries for a limited time, right? These are copyright laws and federal patent laws, federal trademark laws, all right? All these fall within the federal government's purview, right? And they need somebody to enforce them, right? The Copyright Office, the Federal Patent Office, they have people to enforce these laws. Well, another power, big power that the federal government has is the power to establish judicial tribunals, right? The the Constitution creates the Supreme Court, but it also gives the federal government to establish other courts, federal circuit courts, right, or appeals courts, federal district courts, or trial courts. All those fall under the Constitution and powers given to the federal government. So the federal government can establish which courts they want. They want more appellate courts, trial courts. That's within the federal government's right to do that through the Constitution. And again, remember, the Supreme Court was established by the U.S. Constitution itself. But it also didn't limit that the federal government can establish other judicial tribunals. All right. Another power granted to the federal government, the power to make and enforce laws related to piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the laws of nation. All right. So again, we're thinking, power to enforce laws related to piracies and felonies committed on the high seas. What does that mean for us as law enforcement officers? Working maybe for NCIS, working for the Coast Guard, law enforcement. All right. Opportunities here, things to think about as you think about your career. One of the biggest powers, maybe not directly related to law enforcement, is the power of the federal government to declare war. And an interesting thing is Congress has this power. Congress has the power to declare war. During wartime, Congress, domestic power is expanded, and that would otherwise be unconstitutional. All right, so think about this. Only Congress has the power to declare war. Congress has the power to declare war. And during wartime, Congress can expand its domestic powers that would otherwise, in times of peace, be unconstitutional. All right? And remember, the president, even though the president doesn't have the power to declare a war, the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed services itself. All right. A lot to think about there. All right. The last thing, with regards to the last clause, the federal government has the power to raise and support an army and navy to provide for their regulations. All right. They can enact drafts. They can acquire land for military installations. They can establish military regulations. And most importantly for us is they can set military courts. All right. They can establish a military court. So within the powers granted by the federal government, declare war and also raise and support an army through taxes. And they can also enact drafts, acquire lands, and establish military regulations. All right. One of the other powers that the federal government has is the power to organize a militia and call that militia into service. They have the power to establish organize a militia and call that militia into service of the U.S. when necessary to execute federal laws. And this is pretty much known as the National Guard, right? The National Guard is the militia, the federal government's militia, so to speak. Power to organize a militia and call that militia into service. Some of the final thoughts on what the powers of the federal government. Powers of the government, powers to govern the District of Columbia and all federal enclaves and establishments. So they have jurisdiction over D.C., military posts, national parks, federal governments, and even if those federal governments are located within a state. Right, so that falls under federal purview. D.C., military posts, national parks, those are all federal. So if you become a national park ranger, that's a federal establishment. Finally, the catch-all, as I call it, the catch-all clause of powers granted to the federal government. There's a power to enact all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the specifically enumerated powers. All right, this is known as the necessary and proper clause, catch-all clause. Right, the government can fall back on this. Enact all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its execution of specific enumerated powers, necessary and proper clause. All right, and this was established in the case of McCutcheon versus Maryland, right, in 1819, where it said the federal government has the implied power to adopt any measures not prohibited by the constitutions that are appropriate to carry its enumerated powers into effect. Right, so very important case. McCutcheon versus Maryland gave a lot of power to the federal government. The federal government has the implied power to adopt any measures not prohibited by the Constitution that are appropriate to carry out its enumerated powers into effect. All right, just some minor things. State powers here. That's some things that the states are forbidden to exercise. Right, so Article 1, Section 10. States themselves cannot enter into treaties or alliances or confederations with a foreign power or another state. All right, so they cannot enter into treaties with other nations or other states. It's prohibited by the states to do. They cannot coin money. They cannot lay duties on imports or exports. Right, so if you're a lot to do with interstate commerce, right? You can't lay a duty or a tariff on an import or export. That's a federal thing. Also, powers that the states are forbidden: keep troops or ships of war in times of peace. Can't do it, right? Can't keep troops or ships of war in times of peace. They also cannot pass bill of attainder, ex post facto laws, which we'll get to, or laws impairing the obligation of contract. States can't say you can't enter into these form of contracts. That's a federal thing. All right, what do I mean by ex post facto laws? It means after the fact. Right? These protect an accused person from being disadvantaged by changes made in law after committing an act that would subject to prosecution at a later time. All right, ex post facto laws. You can't change the law as you go along, right? Ex post facto laws change the elements of a crime. Right? You can't change the elements of a crime after the person has been arrested. The criminalization of activity that was previously illegal, right? Increase the punishment. You can't do that. Reduce evidence needed to convict, right? None of these ex post facto laws can be applied retroactively. Important for us. We'll look into that a little bit more as we go along. But just know the concept of ex post facto laws mean after the fact. So after the person has been arrested, you can't change the elements of a crime. You can't criminalize activity that was previously legal. You can't increase punishment, and you can't reduce evidence needed to convict. You just can't do it. That's the ex post facto law. Finally, the 10th Amendment itself. The 10th Amendment and the powers reserved to the states. This basically says all powers not delegated would be reserved to the states and the people. This is known, and when you read the cases, this is known as the police powers of the state. Right? States have the police powers. Right? So the 10th Amendment, all powers not delegated would be reserved to the states and the people. This is known as the police powers of the state. All right, but remember, the Supremacy Clause itself, federal law supersedes and annuls any state law. When the two conflict, it's preemptive. Federal law preempts state law when the two are at odds or conflict. All right. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, comments, or criticisms about or want any follow-up on this PowerPoint and this presentation, just feel free to reach out. Thank you.